We're going to chat now about a phenomenon you might be seeing right now. Given the time of year in the spring, we tend to see the bees a little bit more active. And specifically here in North Carolina, we have lots and lots of ground bees. So usually when we think about bees, we think about bees that are like hanging from a hive on a tree, right? But usually here in North Carolina, just based on the ratio of ground bees we have, you're more likely to see a bee that's coming out of the ground, I guess you might say. And that's where they live most of the year. But this time of year, they're a little bit more active. I recently sat down with Gabriella Garrison, who's with North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, to talk about why these bees are really not dangerous, why you should try to leave them alone if you can, and how else you can behave around the bees, and what you can do to help the bees if you are interested in increasing our pollinator population here. Let's listen in. All right, so Gabriella, tell us a bit about what's happening this time of year. Folks might be seeing swarms of bees more frequently than usual, right?
That's right. So it usually starts the end of February, give or take the weather, but this is the time of year where we start seeing our native ground nesting bees emerging from the ground. That's where they've been spending all winter, and they start coming up as adults, and they're looking for food and they're looking for mates. And so this time of year, we often get calls from folks that are maybe rightfully concerned because they see all these bugs or bees hovering on the surface, whether it's in their lawn or the park, and they're a little bit concerned. They want to know about what's happening, and they want to know if they should do something about it. So that was the impetus behind writing this piece, to let people know that they are actually quite harmless, and we're excited to see them. We're happy when they come back.
So I actually, very timely, I was actually in North Georgia this past weekend visiting family, and we went out on a hike through one of the preserves nearby, and I actually saw these ground bees like coming out of what appeared to be a hole in the ground. And I think
Yes.
people might not know that bees like to be in the ground just because we have this concept of maybe like a hive hanging from a tree or something like that.
Yeah, so a lot of people, when they think about bees, they think of honeybees, but those are actually not native. They were brought over from Eurasia and Africa hundreds of years ago. And we actually have in North Carolina over 500 species of bees, about 560. And the large majority of them, about 70% of them, are solitary and they live in the ground. And so when they emerge, they're quite harmless. The females are capable of stinging. The males don't sting. They don't have that anatomical part. But the females don't have this large hive like you were mentioning with honeybees. They don't have a colony. They really don't have this large area to protect. So they're actually quite timid, and all they want to do is create their burrows in the ground where they lay eggs and they create the next generation. And then they're done, essentially. So when people see bees that are emerging and hovering about the surface, they tend to only be around for a month, maybe even less. The majority of their life cycle is spent underground. They're only above ground and active and visible to our eyes, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, depending on the species. So another thing to remember is, like I said, they're quite timid, they're quite harmless. When I see them, I get so excited and I want to take a lot of pictures of them. So I'll go sit in the middle of the aggregation. That's what we call them. Even though they're solitary, they tend to all aggregate together, safety in numbers perhaps. And I sit there because I want to take pictures of these adorable little bees that are coming in and out of their burrows. And they're so scared of me. And so I have to sit there for 5 or 10 minutes because as soon as I sit down, they scurry down their tunnel and they wait for me to leave. And so eventually, if I'm patient enough, they'll come back up and I can get pictures. But that's just to let people know that they are not out to chase you or to sting you. They just want to go about their business, and they're really cute if you get a good look at them.
Well, I guess on that note, I mean, because we have done stories before with beekeepers who sometimes might have to go out and attend to a swarm that might be in an inconvenient place. And usually when I think about the cases we hear about, they're not necessarily the bees in the grounds. They might be
Mhm.
nesting in like a school, like in the side of a school or something like that. And then the beekeeper will take the queen and try to move her somewhere else and then get the hive to relocate. Is that even necessary, or is that even possible in this type of situation, given the fact that the bees are probably in the ground, going to go back to the ground in a few weeks?
Yep. So relocating them, is really not possible. But if you can be patient, like I said, it's just 2 or 3 weeks, give or take, they're going to be gone. So what draws people's attention to them are their burrows, like you mentioned. And so they kind of look like these little mini volcanoes as they're emerging from the ground. And there's little piles of dirt on the sides of these little mini volcanoes. And there's a little hole on top. And it's literally just big enough for this tiny little bee to go in and out of. So that's sort of the search image. And sometimes there can be, again, aggregation. So maybe hundreds on the landscape, maybe 15 or 20. But it's really hard to relocate them because they're in the ground. So, and sometimes they can be several centimeters, sometimes several inches underground. So we don't want to go to those lengths to have that much ground moving happening. But what I've seen some people do, especially in public areas, they put up that orange temporary fencing around the area and some signs just to let people know that these are ground nesting bees, they're native pollinators, they're really beneficial. We want to have them, but for that time that they're active and above the surface, let's just give them a little bit of space. And then once they're done, we can remove the fencing. And after a couple of rains that wash away any evidence of those burrows, you don't even know that they're there. So think about that. All year you're walking over this area and there could be hundreds, maybe thousands of little bees developing underneath your feet, which to me is kind of a cool thought. So really, if you can just give them space for them to do what they have to do for that brief period of time, then I think everybody can coexist together.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that that's important. The bees are really beneficial in a lot of different ways. It makes me sad to think that there are some cases where maybe people might misunderstand their existence, or they want to eliminate them basically. And that makes me sad to think about, considering all they do for our area.
Yeah, exactly. So we have so many beautiful flowering plants, right, on our landscape. And our native bees, our native pollinators, they're responsible for over 80% of pollination for all of those plants. And then from an agricultural perspective, from an economical perspective, they contribute millions, maybe even billions of dollars to our crop economy. So they're really important for those reasons. But sometimes people don't even think about the ecosystem services that they provide in terms of a healthy soil ecosystem. So we have such a vibrant ecosystem in the soil right underneath our feet. And you have these bees that are creating all these little burrows, which are essentially aerating the soil, right? So they're allowing the movement of water and air and nutrients through the soil. So that's really beneficial as well. So we always try to make people aware of all of these ecosystem services, free ecosystem services that these little bees are contributing. And again, emphasizing the fact that they don't want to sting you, they don't want to harm you, they really just want to go about their business.
Now that, there was, for example, we were talking about this offline, a license plate campaign called Save the Bees that they have in North Carolina. And I've seen them in other states too, but it's really an intentional, like, just messaging of, hey, these are important. Folks maybe can learn a little bit more about protecting the bees. I guess my first question on that vein is, how is the bee situation? How's the pollinator situation in North Carolina, if we know? And then I am curious what folks can do to improve that if it does need improving.
Yeah, so there's still a lot that we're learning about all of our bees, about all of these ground nesting bees, especially because if you think about it, they're really pretty hard to study, just for the reason that they're only active and visual to us for such a short amount of time, and then they disappear under the surface. And it's not like we can stick little cameras in the ground to really monitor what they're doing. So we're still doing a lot of research to learn more about these bees and their preferences and what kind of areas they like. But there are lots of things that people can do to protect them. For instance, be aware, educate yourself that when you see these areas, when you see these bees moving around, don't automatically jump to hauling out the gasoline can and pouring gasoline in the holes, or sometimes people turn on their sprinklers to try to flood the areas, to flood out the bees. Ask questions. There are folks like us at the Wildlife Resources Commission, the local cooperative extensions, the local universities, all those folks are there to answer your questions. I always tell people, if you're really concerned, send pictures, send me a picture, send the cooperative extension a picture to try to help you figure out what you have on your landscape. That's really important. And then providing habitat for these bees, because one of the biggest problems that they're experiencing is habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, climate change, pesticide use. So there's no one thing in particular that's causing the most decline. It's kind of a combination of all of these different elements that are really causing these populations to decline overall. And we know that they're declining. We're just trying to figure out at what level, how quickly they're declining. Some species are being impacted more than others. But if you want to do something, the best thing you can do is create a habitat on your landscape that's welcoming for these bees. So in the case of ground nesting bees, they prefer sort of sparsely vegetated, well-drained soil, bare areas where they can create the tunnels to lay their eggs for their nest. They like sunnier areas. They tend to like south-facing slopes. So those are things that you can do. Plant native plants. We're really fortunate in North Carolina that we have a lot of native nurseries that are popping up where we can buy native plants from. And that's really important because what do these bees need when they're emerging? They need pollen and they need nectar to feed themselves and to feed their young. So those are both things that are really good and easy for us to do as a community.
You mentioned the native plant situation. I mean, I've been seeing a lot lately about, homeowners rethinking what their lawns might look at like, because, obviously there's a standard in our country about having, the nice manicured green lawn.
Yeah.
But I'm seeing more and more folks moving towards like clover lawns and other types of, I guess, garden areas on their property that they're calling pollinator gardens. What sort of specific plants might folks consider here in this area?
Yeah, so I think one of the most important things to remember is that the plant species aside, you want to make sure that you have plants blooming throughout the growing season, right? Because even though we're having a pulse right now of bees emerging, we have bees that are active and above the surface or out of their cavity all the way from February until, in North Carolina, September or October, right? Until we hit that first freeze. And so you want to make sure that you're picking plants that have some kind of bloom at all of those various times. And so we always classify it as 3 bloom periods. We have spring, we have summer, and we have fall. And there are a lot of different plants that you could put in the ground that would attract bees at all of those different times. You could think about shrubs. Shrubs are really important too. I always love asters and goldenrods, milkweed when it's in bloom. It's a really popular plant and it's a host plant for monarchs. So that's a really good one too. In the spring, I always try to encourage people to plant things like elderberry. That's a great one. New Jersey tea. Then as far as trees, willow trees, if you have wetter areas, maple trees are great. Black cherry trees are really important for an early source of nectar. And, of course, a lot of it's going to depend, too, on what you're able to find at your local nursery because their inventory is going to sort of vary and depend on what they're able to grow. But the great thing about some of these local nurseries is that they have staff that are really knowledgeable and they can help you figure out what works really well in your neck of the woods. So as an example, I live in the Sandhills, and what I would plant here is going to look really different than what someone might plant in Charlotte just because our soil types are so different. So talking to those folks at the local nurseries, they have that knowledge and they can help you pick things that are going to do well in your climate and your soil.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting conversation. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to add that folks should know about this topic? Or just in general, I guess, timely, we've got Earth Day coming up, so I feel like this is kind of an adjacent topic as we talk about, one of the great species of our Earth and all the good things that it does for the Earth. But anything you'd like to leave us with before we wrap things up?
Gosh, I guess I want to emphasize, bees are such an important species. All the pollinators, all the insects are really important. And I feel like a lot of people get a little squeamish when they see bugs and when they see things flying around. So I would really encourage people to educate yourself, read a little bit more about bees, trying to figure out what some of them look like so you know what you're looking at. And like I said before, do not ever hesitate to ask questions because that's what folks like us are here for, to help you understand understand what's on your landscape. And then, other than educating yourself, really try to create that habitat, because we're in a situation right now, especially in North Carolina, where we're seeing so much development and we're losing habitat at such a quick, such a rapid pace. And that really affects all of our wildlife. So trying to put some of that habitat back on the ground is pretty low hanging fruit, I think, for a lot of us. Whether you have a quarter of an acre or 1 acre or 10 acres, just a little quarter-acre garden is so impactful for some of these pollinators. So really important to add that habitat to your yard if you can.